Hi, I'm Valerie Englehart, and in this video I am going to be painting a Thai angel statue on top of a loose, intuitive watercolor wash. I am only going to be using 4 colors because I do like to work with a minimum palette, but I do like to use a range of colors. So right there I have splashed some quinacridone gold into Rockwell Canada Peach Fairy. The other 2 colors that I'm going to be introducing are Rockwell Canada's Fall Story and another Rockwell Canada color, Landmark, which is a brown. Fall Story is a warm green. I put a little bit of salt up in the top because I love the texture I get from salt. And I've got my board up at an angle. I paint on a watercolor block, and this is a Hanamule rough press, 140 pound. This is my first time using this paper, and I gotta say I rather like it. I'm excited to use it going forward. So here I am just plopping color all around my paper because I find it a lot easier to paint on top of a colorful wash because then I can use all of the colors and textures to help me space where I'm going to put my elements since I do not have a preliminary sketch. One key for getting these big, juicy washes is to use fresh pigment from the tube. That way you can get intense color and lots of water because you want that pigment to move. With the wash dry, I am starting with just putting in the idea of certain shapes. So there's a circle portion on the headpiece of the Thai angel, and I'm going to be building all of my shapes out from that. So I'm picking kind of a focal point and then branching everything from there. Because I don't have a sketch, I do have to sort of mentally plan how large my elements are going to be. Because if I don't do that, then I have a tendency to paint too big and I have way too much falling right off the paper. Now it is good in a composition to have things come off of the paper where it just falls off the edge, so to speak, but it's better if that's planned. And in this case, some of it is planned. I'm focusing on the head, the headpiece, and then a little bit of the shoulder that is in the front. But for now, I'm just using the exact same colors. I'm going to be using the same colors throughout the piece, just in different intensities to focus on values. And that's very helpful in painting anything, is to focus on values. But one of the fun things about doing such a nice colorful wash is I don't have to try and make something look realistic in terms of its color. I just need to focus on the dark, the light, the shape. And in this case, the quinacridone gold is going to help me in places where I don't have the white of the paper and I don't want it to be the lightest value, but I can bring attention to it as if a part is in the sunlight. But at this point of the painting, I'm kind of just mapping out where I want my shapes to be. And I am starting everything from that dot, that circle that I painted, and then measuring things out from there. So then I painted one eye, and then I used that as a measurement visually for painting in the next eye. And a lot of this painting is where I put down some strong color, and then I use a clean, damp brush to drag the pigment to give it like a soft gradient or to bleed it away. I've got frogs croaking so loud outside my studio. I wonder if the microphone is picking them up. And a small part of me kind of hope it is because I love listening to them as they start to wake up in the spring. Okay, so right now I want to point out this thing's looking pretty ugly, isn't it? And I'm calling that out because so many times early in a painting, it starts to go through that ugly phase and we want to give up. We're just like, oh, this painting is not turning out right. There's no way it's going to be fine. And with watercolor being transparent, there's that idea of, oh, well, if it's already bad at this stage, there's nothing I can do. Not true. Not true. Especially since I'm painting on a modeled wash, anything I go over later, I can disguise it as being part of that wash. Another technique I'm going to be using a lot in this painting is lifting. I will be lifting with just my regular brush. That's a silver black velvet. I think that's my size 12. But there will be points where I bring out stiffer brushes to really scrub away some of that pigment. But back to the whole it going through an ugly phase. I was at a point in this painting where I, as I do in almost every painting, I think, went, ugh, why am I doing this? This is awful. What a waste of time. I should just do something else. But because I know I think that every time, I knew to keep going. And at this point, I'm still in the mapping out of shapes phase and values and trying to keep the colors dancing around because it's really easy when doing a value painting to stick to one color and then just vary its values. And that can look beautiful, but in this case, I wanted it to be very colorful and exciting. And the last thing I want this piece to be is boring. So I'm just going in and putting in nice, bright, fun colors. But I do want to keep the piece cohesive, which is why you don't see me pulling out a palette with like dozens of colors. Some people can do that and it looks fantastic, but anytime I do it, I get confused and overwhelmed. So most of my paintings really only use about 4 to 6 colors. And that just works for me. Okay, I keep derailing. Back to the whole ugly stage thing. So whenever you're painting, if you are hitting that piece or the part where you're just getting frustrated, it's okay to step back. Though if you can bleed things away before stepping back, go ahead and do that. Leave yourself a soft edge. You can always put a hard edge back in later. But just know that if you keep going, this is only the second wash of the entire painting, really. And I'm just setting up the skeleton. Like, the skeleton is going to look different from the body, as I very well assume based on medical books. Our skeleton looks very different from our fleshy form. So just understand, this is just the skeleton. We're going to build on it. And not to give up so quickly. And who knows? Maybe if it does turn out to be a disaster, then you can learn from it, or start pulling out fun products like crackle paste, or maybe even some acrylic inks and alcohol, rubbing alcohol. I've not tried drinking alcohol on watercolor. That might be something for a video, seeing like how it responds to vodka or something. That could be a fun idea. I wonder if it reacts similarly as to isopropyl alcohol. All right, I'm gonna put a bookmark on that one. But just keep pushing through, use each of these paintings as a learning experience, and just have fun, because I don't usually use these colors, and I was enjoying it immensely. So here I've pulled out a stiff filbert brush, just some cheapsy one I bought, probably at Michael's years ago. And I'm finding this Hanamule paper, the pigment lifts really well. It is important to understand the properties of your pigments. These very heavily granulating ones typically lift very well. But for example, the quinacridone gold is a highly staining color. So while it can be lifted, you'll never lift it back to the white of the paper. And in this piece, I am using a lifting technique to bring back some of my lighter values. And I like that in a way because it creates a soft transition. And that's very much what that statuette looked like when I saw it. This is inspired by a little statue that I saw in my mother-in-law's home while we were visiting a couple years ago. And I thought it was so interesting. I took a picture and then was asking questions about it. And it's just been sitting in my phone for years, just waiting for me to finally feel brave enough to paint it. Also, it's not the part I'm working on, but do you see that watermark on the left side of the face? I just love that. I love those little surprises you can get in watercolor when you're painting all loose and splashy. You get those gorgeous textures that you just don't really get with any other medium. And that makes watercolor so much fun for me. It like practically paints itself. And those salt textures on the side and at the top, I love using the salt textures. So different artists have different takes on how to complete a piece. With some, they want to do like an entire composition in the stages, and others will finish a portion before moving on. And so by that I mean, at least for the second part, There are some artists that I know of that will like do a sketch, but they'll hyper focus on one part of the painting, make it really nice before moving on. And while that's not how I work, maybe that's how you want to work. And that's why I want to bring it up. And an advantage there is that you've not spent your entire time on an entire piece before knowing if something's going to work or not. But it also gives motivation to keep going. So for example, if you're painting a person, a portrait, and their hand's in it, and you paint that hand just chef's kiss perfectly, that piece is done. Well, now you got to paint everything else. Well, now there's a lot of drive to want to paint the rest of the piece because you painted that one part so incredibly. So I don't know if that works for everyone, but if that's something you haven't considered and you think that might work for you, give it a try. And I find myself doing that a little bit in this piece, where I focus on one section. Sure, I could do everything in a, here's my light values, now let's go paint in my midtones, now let's go do in my darks everywhere. But my brain doesn't focus like that. Right now, my brain is very much like, I want to do the face, so I'm doing the face. And eventually, I'm going to get bored of the face. Even though there might be a lot more left to do, I do get bored. And so having all of those other places is great for my brain, because then I can be like, ooh, let's do the next shiny object. And then I'll work on that, and then I'll get bored of that, and then I can come back to the face. And by that point, the face should be dry, and I can work on the next step. All right, about to commit to a jawline. So I've picked up my darkest paint, which is that Landmark Brown, and I am now putting in the shape of the jaw. Adding in some green, just because I like to go in with multiple colors. And I'm not going to outline the entire face. I used a bit of quinacridone gold on the right side of the face, just to give a hint of where the line of the face is. But that side, I'm going to keep fairly ambiguous, as if it's in shadow, melting into the background, etc. And I do that in quite a bit of my work, where I just let some of it fade away. Let it be ambiguous. Let the mind fill in where the rest of that shape is. Got my liner brush now, and I'm just going in, popping in some dark pigment to add deeper shadow and greater dimension to the piece. And I just want to point out, so on that left eye, you can't see me doing this, but every time I say left or right, I have to hold up one of my hands and make that L shape to see what side I'm talking about. But the left eye, I didn't outline the entire eye, I left a gap. And I just find, personally, that leaving gaps and things looks nice. Better than having everything outlined, at least for my style. So there's a little tip. Try when you're putting in a line, leave a little break in the line. And don't be afraid to pop in a dark tone. Plus, things will usually look really dark at first in watercolor, but it dries like 50% lighter. And so often I'll go in dark and I'm like, oh no, that's too dark. I lighten it a little bit, and then after it dries, I'm like, oh, now I gotta go in again because it's not dark enough. Now, I don't want to put a lot of detail at the very bottom of the painting, but I do want something to be there. And I like that there's kind of this ribbed collar, or like folded fabric. But those shapes gave great rhythm in that it was in like a line of 3. It's a collar. You've seen a human being wearing a shirt, I'm sure. So now I'm just adding some details. I'm not going to go in with as much detail as I will on the headpiece and sections of the face, but I do want those details to be there. Otherwise, it kind of looks unfinished or like I got way too lazy. All right, moving on to the headpiece, I'm adding a bit of a shadow underneath where that connects to the forehead. And I'm going to do that on both sides. Just drop in some paint. I found out that was a bit too much, so then bleed it away. One question I get asked is about mud, like the mixing of colors. How do you avoid making mud? And if you're unfamiliar with that term, it's where like you've overworked the paint and it looks, people say like mud, but sometimes mud can be kind of cool, but it just looks gross. It looks like a mistake. And so whenever I paint, I don't mix my colors off to the side, I go in and layer the colors almost like a glaze, but not quite. And then that way you get the tones of the other colors showing through. And so I let them mix naturally on the page. And by doing that and not disturbing the pigment too much, it lets it interact with each other and allows you to get these lovely gradients and transitions that are beautiful in watercolor without the making of said mud. Though another little tip I will make for that is, if you are using paints that you are not terribly familiar with their properties and how they work with each other, just grab a little scrap of paper. I have tons of scraps of paper around my desk where before I start a new composition, will just quickly plop little splotches of paint on and watch how the colors interact and fuse. Because some colors just don't really go super well together. They don't play nice. And luckily, I had already tested these colors. I knew they played well together. And quinacridone gold plays pretty well with almost everything. It can be a bit bossy and push things, but it's not heavy. It's very transparent. And I love the sunny glow it gives. So yeah, if there's a yellow or a paint that you are wondering what you should add to your palette, quinacridone gold. I could not paint without it. Okay, yes, literally, I could paint without it, but you know what I mean. It's my favorite yellow by far. So at this point, I have sped the video up by about, and all of these are sped up by about 200%, because otherwise this video would be a couple hours long. This painting took quite a bit of time because there are all those little lines and shapes, and I tend to rush my paintings, and this one I kept telling myself, just take your time. Take your time. I used a tissue there to blot out the excess pigment in that second circle on the headpiece. Oh, that initial circle wasn't on the headpiece, it was just on the forehead. It had been long enough since I'd seen it that I forgot what that piece was, even though if I just look over at the other side of my desk, the painting is right there. Go figure. So in that other part of the... Is this a crown? I should probably look up what this is called. But that other spiking bit, I just go in with my brush and do flick a line, flick a line, flick a line to create rhythm and consistency. And don't know if you can tell at this point, I don't paint incredibly realistically. I do like to have realistic proportions and fairly realistic subjects, but I'm not out to create a photorealistic copy. I really want to capture like my interpretation. And I have to say, this painting in particular is definitely a test of my patience, because there are so many little shapes and forms that I have to wait for certain segments to dry before I go back in, and I am incredibly impatient. So this was definitely a good exercise for me in patience and detail work, because I think I've mentioned it, I get bored really easily. I always want to go on to the next shiny thing. So this in particular was a fantastic exercise for me in that it has enough elements going on that it kept me interested, but I still had to practice patience. And I advise that of you too. Enjoy the painting process. Let it take its time. Have a conversation with it. I mean, it doesn't have to be literal. The conversation is you, the paint, the brush, the paper. But you know what? I'm not going to judge. Go ahead and talk to it. I'm not there. All right, and on this headpiece, same thing as I usually do. Little lines, and then I will use a clean, damp brush to soften things. And that way, there's a bit of a gradient in my shadow. Instead of it being just one value, it can shift between a couple values and thus being a little more visually appealing, like a shadow in real life. Well, that's another tip I can throw in. So I'm working from a photograph right now. And photographs are great because the subject doesn't move and I can capture something and come back to it whenever I want. Like I said, I'd taken this picture years prior. but photographs really flatten things. And don't go in with your shadows just being gray. There's color in shadows, and there are some amazing paintings where the true subject of the painting is the cast shadow of the object. Too bad none of those are my paintings, or I would link them. But play with shadows. Next time you paint something and there's a cast shadow, just throw in a really unexpected color. Someone once painted a bicycle and it had like a red shadow, and they'd used I don't know if it was salt, probably just water droplets to create a texture and a mottled effect within the shadow, so it also looked like there was light filtering through leaves that you couldn't see in the painting. Just marvelous. So don't just go in with a dark color, a blue, a gray, a purple. Get creative with your shadows, because shadows are what give your subject form. Or another way to think of it, for at least this piece, and it helped me with all these little shapes, is, and I heard this one from the great Thomas Schaller, was what you're doing is subtracting the light. So the painting's already partway done, the light's there, you just have to go in and subtract the light. So that really helped me out, and I hope that little tidbit helps you too. I stumbled over my words there. Another thing that's nice about quinacridone gold is, even though it's a yellow, you can get a pretty decent value shift out of it compared to some other yellows. So I can actually go in and paint in shapes, and therefore you get these really warm golden shadows that aren't too dark, because not all shadows need to be that number 9 and 10 on the value scale. Well, you could end up with a really interesting painting, but more than likely it wouldn't be the effect you're looking for. But quinacridone gold, another recommendation for it, in that it is dark enough that you can get form and shadow. And I just love how it glows. So you may have noticed, but if you haven't, I'll go ahead and call it out, that I have the right side of the statue to be more on the sunny side, so that side has more of the quinacridone gold. There's very little of it on the left side of the painting, except anywhere where there's a bit of a protrusion that might catch the light. And so really I am using quinacridone gold as saying, here's where something peeks out and can see sunlight. But I'm mostly keeping it as a shift of yellow to green to pink to brown, whereas the left side has more of your pinks and browns. I use the green in both places because green is really the predominant color in the painting. But I do keep, at least down on the face, it is more on the right side. As we go up the crown, because as it gets taller and closer to the sun, I do shift that shadow to where there's a lot more yellow, and shifting that green more to the left. That way it's not like this vertical column of here's all of your gold and here's all of your green, etc., etc. I want those colors to dance and give the illusion of where the sun is shining. And fun thing as an artist, in my painting, obviously I have a light source, but in my photograph, this statuette is in an office, and there really wasn't any sunlight hitting it. It didn't have incredibly strong light source, so any of these shadows that get really deep, I'm manufacturing. Going, oh, this side of it is in sunlight, and it's golden and warm and radiant. Well, that's where I pull out my handy-dandy artistic license and manufacture that. Going in now, popping in some deep darks in some of those shapes to really make them pop. All right, here's that stiff brush I talked about early on in the video. So this one is specifically a scrubber brush. Its purpose is to scrub and lift paint off the paper. So I'm going through and scrubbing out highlights and then using my tissue paper to dab off the reactivated pigment. Now, it is a very, very stiff brush. So while great for scrubbing, if you scrub it too hard, you can scrub a hole right through your paper. And it does damage the paper. But damaging paper for the sake of art, I mean, well, that's completely fine. I've already covered this paper in paint. What else am I supposed to do? But with the way that some people paint in glazes and such, having damage to a paper can affect things if you go and paint over it later. So I am nearing the end of my painting. I'm not done by any means. I'm missing the entire top part of the headpiece. But again, it was one of those things where I got bored and I wanted to experiment and just shift gears to keep myself interested. So I went in with my scrubber brush and I'm going and scrubbing some highlights because I am very confident that I'm not going to need to go over those areas later. And like a lot of things in life, painting is about having confidence. If you go into an area over and over because you don't feel confident about it, that's going to show. But if you go in and you make a mark with confidence, it's more likely to blend in and be natural. And there are some times where I make a quote-unquote mistake, but because I leave it and don't mess with it, as the composition emerges, it actually looks like it was always supposed to be there, or it actually enhances the piece. I don't think I had anything go on like that in this particular painting, but it just is meant to illustrate that paint with confidence. Once you make a decision, go with it. And if something happens, sometimes it's better to leave it. And as usual, the dance, let things dry, go in with a dark color. Let things dry, go in with a dark color. Use a liner brush, make my shapes. All right, now I am ready to paint the top of this. And I am so eager to finish at this point. So the very top of the headpiece has sort of these floral ornaments that I don't see anywhere else on the crown. But luckily, I paint flowers a lot, so I'm pretty confident going in, making some nice curved shapes and then bleeding them away. So I'm just paying attention to the photo and trying to use what I already have. Because whenever I did that wash where I just sort of splopped in where shapes were going to go, I wasn't super exact. I was like, this is going to be a map of what I'm going to do, and hopefully I placed this right. And I think in this case, I placed things well enough that I could work with it. It's going to be a little harder for me to work with the left side than this right side because the right side did merge into that background beautifully and allowed me to just add in some dark lines so that it looked like, oh, of course there was this lovely rosette type thing there. But on the left side, I see that very hard, dark mark. And I'm going to work with it, and it's going to be fine. All right, going into that left side now, and definitely going in with that landmark color. And I'm okay with this being more ambiguous because the top of the headpiece is not my focal point. But I do want to put enough there that says, I totally know what these shapes are. Plus, I'm also having so much fun with this painting that I was actually hitting a point where I had to tell myself to stop. And that's another thing. Stop before you think it's done. Just step away for a while and then come back with fresh eyes. Because many a painting goes awry because it's painted far longer than it needed to be. Luckily, in this case, I actually think I stopped at a great time when I finally do stop. But there have been paintings of mine where if I had just stopped maybe 5 brush strokes prior, it was actually done then. So I think right here is actually a pretty good example of that hard line I have at that upper left portion that isn't quite jiving with that floral ornamental piece. I'm still going to leave it alone. Because if I go in and start trying to scrub and lighten that section, it's more likely to actually draw more attention there than just by leaving it alone. There's not so much interest and contrast up there to draw the eye and have that be my focal point. So by just letting it be, it's fine. But if I went in and started scrubbing, it would become pretty obvious that I was trying to hide something or correct something. But right now, I'm just scrubbing in little highlights in places where I actually do very intentionally want there to be a soft highlight. Right now, I have pulled out some gouache to help things pop a little more. I am not a watercolor purist. I'll go in with gouache. And something I was having to tell myself the entire time I was using this gouache was, don't use too much of it. Don't use too much of it. Don't highlight everything. Because when you highlight everything, well, then you may as well not be highlighting anything. So it was something that I was definitely having to remind myself almost constantly. So I do love how even adding it can help give more dimension to your shapes. So kind of like that diamond, triangular-ish shape on top. By adding that little line, it makes it look even more three-dimensional. And as you can see, the white gouache works better on much darker colors than it does on lighter colors. Because obviously if you put white on off-white, it's not going to show as much as like white on top of sepia, for instance. So I am going to use it on places that are more of a mid-tone or a light tone, just because there will still be a subtle shift, but it really pops on places where the paint is dark. And my cat's here to say hi. Hi, Chai. And one nice thing about gouache is it is a water-soluble paint. It's similar to watercolor, but it is opaque. So if I do something wrong that I don't like, I can lift it and move it. However, I would have to be careful about moving my layers underneath. So with gouache, I take the same approach as I do with many things, and that is go in with confidence. And if there's something I don't like, maybe lightly smudge it with my finger, but otherwise just leave it. Unless it's really bad, just leave it. See right there, I thought the line was a little too strong, just brought in my brush to soften it a little. So I'm not trying to erase it, but just a little softer. Adding a little more line to the jaw. And there's my finished painting. If you like this video, press that like button so I know to make more like this. And if there's anything you want to see from me, let me know in the comments because I'm always looking out for more subjects to paint. And if you want to see more from me, subscribe to my channel because I make videos every Monday and Thursday. Thanks so much for watching. See you later. Bye!